Mom's sick, so I came instead. Widow's daughter rode to Millionaire Cowboy's ranch. What he did next. The ledger's open to March of an old year, and I've got ink on my thumb again, same as always, because I never learned to hold a pen the way my father held one, light, quick, like it cost him nothing. Mine drags, leaves a smear if I don't blot it fast. I'm blotting it now, sitting at the same desk he sat at, in the same chair, with the same crack running up the left arm of it that I've meant to fix for 11 years and never have. And I'm looking at a column of numbers that don't mean what they used to mean. Cattle bought, cattle sold, wages paid to men whose faces I can't call up anymore. My father started this book the year he came into the valley with nothing but a wagon and a debt, and he taught me early that a man's worth could be read plain in a column of figures, that anything you couldn't put a number to wasn't real, wasn't earned, wasn't yours. I believed him a long time, longer than I should have. There's a page near the back, dated 11 months ago, where the ink changes. Same book, same desk, but a different hand wrote a few lines in the margin, small and careful, nothing like mine. I keep that page open more than any other. I want to tell you how it got there. You have to understand what this ranch was before her, because otherwise none of it lands right. 40,000 acres, give or take what the county surveyor and I still argue about. 3,000 head some years, more in the good ones. A house my father built too big for the family he had, like he knew before any of us that it'd end up holding just one man rattling around in it. I had hired men who called me Mr. Calder to my face and something else behind my back. I never asked what, didn't want to know, though I could guess close enough. I had a foreman I trusted with the cattle and nobody I trusted with anything else. I had more money than any man in that county, and I ate my supper alone, most nights standing up at the kitchen counter, because sitting at the long table by myself made the house feel bigger than it already was. I wasn't unhappy exactly. Unhappy takes more feeling than I was spending on myself in those years. I was just careful. My father had two kinds of men come around after he made his money, men who wanted something from him, and men who wanted to be seen standing near a man who had something. I never met the other kind, the kind that just wanted him, plain, the way you'd want a friend for no reason you could write in a ledger. He didn't either, far as I know. He died believing that was simply how the world worked for men like us, and I'd spent 34 years agreeing with him without ever once testing whether it was true. So when Widow Prentice sent word that her girl was coming instead of her, I didn't think much of it beyond irritation. I needed a housekeeper who could also nurse a man with a bad leg through the worst of a healing, and I'd hired her mother on the recommendation of the doctor in town, sight unseen, because Sarah Prentice had nursed half the valley through one thing or another and asked a fair wage and no foolishness. Then 2 days before she was to start, a boy rode out with a note in a hand I didn't know, saying her mother had taken sick with the same fever going round, and that she was sending her daughter in her place, if that was agreeable, and if it wasn't, she understood. I remember standing in the yard reading that note with my leg throbbing under the split-log brace the doctor had strapped to it, thinking, agreeable, as if I had much choice. As if a man who couldn't walk to his own barn without a stick had the luxury of being particular about who wiped his floors. I sent word back that it was agreeable. I didn't think about it again until she was standing in my kitchen doorway with a carpetbag in one hand and dust on her boots up past the ankle, and I understood I'd been picturing someone else entirely. Flip forward, or maybe it's backward, I've never been sure which direction memory runs, only that it doesn't run straight. I was 19 the first time my father let me write in this ledger myself. He stood behind my chair while I did it, hands folded, watching my letters form like he was grading a horse's gait. I bought 4 steers that spring for $11 a head and sold them in the fall for $19, and when I wrote the profit down, he put his hand on my shoulder, which was as close as the man came to saying he was proud of me. He said, "Son, a number doesn't lie to you, Everything else in this life will, sooner or later, but a number holds still and tells you exactly what a thing is worth. I was 19, and it sounded like wisdom instead of what it actually was, which was a lonely man's excuse for never learning to trust anything that couldn't be counted. I carried that around like scripture for 15 years. Long enough that by the time Joe Prentice stood in my kitchen doorway, I was already doing the arithmetic on her without meaning to. Young woman, no husband, mother sick and needing the wage, come to work in a rich man's house. I had her figured before she'd set her bag down. I want to say I'm not proud of that, but pride's a strange word for it. It was just habit. The same way you don't think about breathing until something makes you notice you're doing it wrong. She didn't set the bag down gentle. She set it down the way you set something down when your arms are tired and you don't care who sees it, and she looked at my leg in its brace and said, "That's a poor job of splinting. Who did that?" Not "Good evening, Mr. Calder," not anything soft. I told her the doctor in town did it, and she made a sound in her throat that told me exactly what she thought of the doctor in town. And then she came across my kitchen, mind, a room she'd been in for 11 seconds, knelt down without asking, and started unwrapping the brace with hands that knew exactly what they were doing. I should say here that I am not a man who gets handled easy. I'd had 3 different women in that county try, over the years, to nurse me or feed me or otherwise attach themselves to the Calder money, and I'd gotten good and quick at putting distance between myself and anybody moving toward me with that particular light in their eye. But there wasn't any light like that in Joe Prentice's eye. There was just work in front of her, and her doing it. She reset the splint tighter, closer to the bone, using a strip torn off her own petticoat when she found my linen closet short on clean cloth, and she didn't ask permission to tear it, just did it fast, like the leg mattered more than the fabric. When she was done, she sat back on her heels and looked up at me. First time she really looked at me, I think, not at the leg, and said, "Mama does this better than me. But I've watched her do it 40 times, so it'll hold." "It's fine," I said, which was a lie, because it was better than fine. It was the first thing in months that had actually stopped hurting. "You're welcome," she said, dry as August, like she'd heard the lie and decided to let it pass. Then she stood, brushed off her skirt, and asked where the flour was kept, because if I meant to eat supper she supposed somebody had better start it, and her mother always said an empty house made a man meaner than he needed to be. I watched her cross my kitchen finding things without being told where they were, moving like she'd already decided the room was hers to manage, and I remember thinking, clear as anything, this one isn't doing arithmetic on me. She's not adding me up, and I didn't know yet what to do with a person who wasn't. The ledger doesn't have a page for that first supper, but I remember the smell of it plainer than I remember whole years. Biscuits and something with sage in it, and under all that, coming off her apron when she leaned across the table to set my plate down, the smell of the road, dust, horse, sun on wool, because she'd ridden 12 miles that day and hadn't so much as combed her hair before she went to work fixing a stranger's leg and cooking a stranger's supper. I ate at my own table for the first time in longer than I could tell you. She ate standing at the counter, the way I usually did, and when I told her to sit, there was room. She said she'd sit when she was invited proper and not before, and something in the way she said it made me understand she wasn't being humble. She was drawing a line. Employer, employee. She'd come to work, not to be folded into a rich man's house, like she owed him gratitude for the wage. I liked her for it before I understood I liked her at all. Here's a thing about a man who spent his whole adult life being wanted for what he has instead of what he is. He gets a particular kind of stupid about it. He starts testing people without meaning to. Little traps laid so quiet even he doesn't always notice he's laying them. I did it to Joe without deciding to. I left money on the kitchen table one evening, more than her week's wage, folded loose where anybody cleaning would find it. Didn't say anything about it. Just left it and watched from the hallway, pretending to check the barometer my father'd hung there. She found it while she was wiping down the table. Picked it up. Counted it quick, the way you'd count anything that wasn't yours before you decided what to do with it. Then she carried it straight to where I stood pretending to study whether I already knew, and held it out flat on her palm. "This isn't mine," she said. "Consider it a bonus." "For what?" I didn't have a good answer because the honest one, for not being like the others, wasn't one I was ready to say out loud to a woman I'd known 5 days. She waited a second, watching me not answer, and then she set the money down on the hall table, careful, like she didn't want it to make a sound. "I don't take money I haven't earned, Mr. Calder. If you want to pay me more, we'll talk wage on the first of the month like decent people do. This," she nodded at the folded bills, "this feels like you're buying something, and I don't know what, and I don't like not knowing." She went back to the kitchen. I stood in that hallway a long while with the money still sitting there, feeling about as foolish as I'd felt since I was a boy caught in a lie, understanding for the first time in my adult life that I'd just tried to buy proof of what a person couldn't be bought into having, and she'd seen straight through it in under a minute. I picked the money back up. I didn't try that particular foolishness again. Some weeks in, the leg mending, I could get around the yard on the stick well enough to be more trouble than help, which is a rancher's particular curse. A man who can walk but can't work is worse off in his own mind than a man laid flat. I'd stand at the corral fence watching Dale Whitfield, my foreman, run the men through branding, and I'd feel about as useful as a fence post. Joe found me there one afternoon, brought me water I hadn't asked for, and instead of fussing over the leg the way I expected, she looked out at the branding same as me and said, "You miss it." Not a question. I didn't answer right off, because nobody had put it to me that plain before, and there was something in having it said out loud that made my chest do something I didn't have a name for. 34 years old and I can't cross my own yard without a stick, I said. Man my age, my money, ought to be past minding a thing like that. Money doesn't fix a leg, she said, and it doesn't stop a man from wanting to be useful. I've watched my mama nurse rich men and poor men both, and the rich ones take it worse every time because they think money's supposed to spare them from feeling small. It doesn't. Nothing does. You just heal or you don't. I looked at her a long moment. She wasn't looking at me soft, wasn't offering comfort the way women had offered it to me before, all cushioned words meant to smooth a man's feelings down flat. She was just telling me true, the way you'd tell a fact about weather. "You don't talk to me like I'm rich," I said. "You're not rich to me," she said. "You're a man with a bad leg who's ill-tempered about it. The money's just a fact about your house. It's not a fact about you." She went back inside before I could think of anything to say to that, which was probably for the best, because I didn't have anything, and a man ought to know when he's been handed something too big to answer quick. "I want to tell you about the night the fever came, because that's the night the ledger's margin got its second hand in it, and everything after runs from that night whether I go forward or back from here. It wasn't my fever, it was hers. She'd been riding out most days by then to check on her mother, 6 miles each way on a borrowed horse, working my house the rest of the daylight, and I should have seen it coming. A person can't burn a candle at both ends forever without the wax running out. She came in from checking her mother one evening, pale under the dust, and I asked was Sarah improving, and she said some, and didn't say anything else, and by full dark she was down with it herself. The same fever, burning so hot I could feel it off her skin from across a room. I sent a man for the doctor. I sat up with her myself, because there wasn't anybody else in that house who knew how, and because, I'll say this plain, since there's no reason left to dress it up, because I wasn't about to leave her to strangers when she hadn't left my leg to strangers. It's a strange thing, sitting up with somebody through a fever. You see them stripped down to whatever's underneath the working and the talking and the careful lines they draw around themselves. Joe Prentice, delirious with fever at 2 in the morning, wasn't drawing any lines at all. She talked about her father, dead 6 years, and about her mother's cough getting worse before it got better. And once, gripping my hand so hard I felt it in my teeth, she said, clear as anything, "Don't let them sell the horse. Mama needs the horse." And I told her nobody was selling any horse, and she quieted some, like she'd believed me. Along toward dawn the fever broke. I know because her hand went slack in mine, and for one bad second I thought I'd lost her, before I felt her breathing even out under my palm, slow and real. She slept the clock around after that. I sat in the chair by her bed most of it, not because there was anything left to do, but because I found I didn't want to be anywhere else, and a man my age ought to know himself well enough to notice when a thing like that means something. When she woke, weak and confused about the hour, the first thing she did was try to sit up and ask after her chores, and I told her to lie back down, that the house could go unswept a day, that nothing in it mattered more than her getting well. She looked at me a long moment, still fever-foggy, and said, "You sat up." "I did. All night. Most of it." She didn't say anything to that right off. Just looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her before, something that had the careful lines all worn down from the fever and hadn't built back up yet. And she reached over slow, like her arm cost her something, and put her hand over mine where it rested on the quilt. "Nobody sat up for me before," she said. "Not since my daddy died. Everybody's always needed me to be the one doing the sitting." I didn't know what to say to that either. I've noticed I didn't know what to say to her a great deal that year, which was new for me, being a man used to knowing exactly where he stood with everybody on account of what he had that they wanted. I just turned my hand over under hers, so we were palm to palm instead of her hand resting on mine, and she let it stay that way a long moment before either of us said anything else. Here's where the story could have gone easy, if it were the kind of story that goes easy. But nothing in that valley ever did, and this one didn't either. Word travels fast where there's money involved, and word had gotten round that the widow's daughter was nursing Wade Calder. That's my name. I ought to have said it plain before now, Wade Calder. Though in that county half the folks just said Calder like there was only one, which there mostly was, and that she'd sat up with him through his leg, and he'd sat up with her through her fever, and small towns being what they are, that got turned into a story a good deal more scandalous than the truth, and a good deal less kind. There's a woman in town, Loretta Vance, whose family had money before mine outgrew it, and whose daughter Cynthia had been paraded past me at every church supper, and danced for 3 years running, on account of everybody in that county understanding a rich man ought to marry a rich woman, the way you'd match good stock to good stock. Loretta Vance came out to my ranch herself one afternoon, uninvited, ostensibly to bring a jar of preserves and inquire after my leg, but really, I understood inside a minute, to look Joe Prentice over and find her wanting. She did it polite. Loretta Vance could gut a person polite. It was her particular gift. She asked Joe, sweet as anything, whether she found the work difficult, being used to smaller houses, and whether her mother's illness left the family in difficult straits, and whether this the sharpest cut, delivered with a smile, whether Joe had always intended to work in service, or whether circumstances had simply required it. Joe answered every question plain and unbothered, the way she answered everything, but I saw the color come up in her neck, saw her hands go still on the dish towel she was holding, and I understood she felt the knife even if she wasn't going to give Loretta Vance the satisfaction of flinching. After Loretta left, I found Joe out back by the woodpile, not crying. She wasn't a woman who cried easy. I'd already learned that much, but standing very straight and very still, looking at nothing. "She meant to make you feel small," I said. "She did make me feel small," Joe said, "for about a minute. Then I remembered I split more wood before breakfast than her daughter split in her whole life, and I felt considerably better." I laughed, which surprised us both, I think. I wasn't a man who laughed free and easy, hadn't been in years, and Joe looked at me sideways with the corner of her mouth going up despite herself. "She's not wrong that I'm a servant in your house," Joe said, quieter now, the humor going out of it. "I know what people are saying. I know how it looks. And I want you to know I never once came out here angling for anything beyond a wage, Mr. Calder. Whatever's happened between us these past weeks, I never meant it to be taken as me working an angle on a rich man. I'd rather you thought poorly of me for no reason than think that of me for a true one." I stood there a long moment, leaning on a stick I barely needed anymore, looking at a woman who just told me, in her own plain way, that she'd rather lose whatever this was between us than let me believe she wanted my money. 34 years old, and I don't believe anybody had ever said a truer thing to me in my life. "Joe," I said, "I've had women angle for this ranch since I was 22 years old. I know exactly what that looks like. It doesn't look like a woman handing folded bills back to me in a hallway and telling me she doesn't like not knowing what she's being bought for. It doesn't look like you." She looked at me a long time after that, steady, like she was deciding whether to believe it. Then she picked the axe back up and split another round of wood hard and said, without looking at me, "Well, good, because I wasn't finished being angry at Loretta Vance, and it helps to have something to hit. I go back further in the ledger, some nights than I mean to. There's a page from the year my mother died, when I was 11, and my father's handwriting on it is the only place in the whole book where the letters go crooked, just for that one entry, before straightening back out on the next line like he'd caught himself feeling something and put a stop to it. I used to think that was strength. I think now it might have been the loneliest thing I ever saw a man do to himself. He raised me to believe feeling was a soft indulgence rich men couldn't afford, on account of everybody around us wanting a piece of what we had, and the only defense was to want nothing back, need nobody, keep the ledger balanced and your own heart out of the columns entirely. I lived by that a long time. It's a hard thing to unlearn at 34, harder still when the whole valley's watching to see if the rich man's finally gone soft over the hired girl, and laying bets, some of them, on how long before he comes to his senses. I want to say I came to mine slow and careful, weighed it all out reasonable. That's not the truth. The truth is I came to my senses the day Joe Prentice's mother took a bad turn, worse than the fever. Some trouble with her heart the doctor said had likely been building years. And Joe came to me white-faced in the yard and said she had to go, had to be with her mother, and didn't know when, if she'd be back. And I understood in about 4 seconds flat that I had exactly 2 choices in front of me, and one of them was going to cost me something I wasn't willing to pay. "Take the wagon," I said. "Take Dale with you to drive it." And Joe, she'd already turned to go and turned back at my voice. "Whatever your mother needs, doctor, medicine, anything, send word and it's done. I don't want you thinking twice about the cost of any of it." She looked at me hard, the old wariness coming back up in her face, the one she'd worn that first evening with the money on the table. "I told you I don't take charity, Mr. Calder." "It's not charity," I said. "It's a debt. You sat up with my leg. You sat up through your own fever worrying more about my sheep than yourself. Don't think I didn't hear you talking nonsense about the flock at 3 in the morning. I'm not offering you charity, Joe. I'm offering you what's owed, and I'd take it as a personal insult if you turned it down out of pride when your mother's the one who'd suffer for it." That landed. I watched it land. She nodded once, sharp, and went to get in the wagon, and just before Dale snapped the reins she looked back at me standing in my own yard on a leg that barely needed the stick anymore. And there was something in her face I hadn't seen there before, not gratitude exactly, something with more weight to it than that. I didn't sleep the 2 nights she was gone. Told myself it was on account of her mother's health, and that was true as far as it went, but it wasn't the whole truth, and a man gets tired of lying to himself somewhere around 34 if he's got any sense left in him at all. Sarah Prentice pulled through. I want that said plain, because there's enough sorrow in most stories like this one, and this part of it, at least, came out kind. Joe came back to the ranch 4 days later, thinner in the face, tired in a way sleep hadn't fixed yet, and I met her in the yard before she'd even climbed down from the wagon seat. I'd been standing there most of the afternoon on some excuse about checking fence that Dale saw straight through and was decent enough not to mention. "She's mending," Joe said before I could ask. "Doctor says slow and steady but mending." "Good," I said. And then, because I'd had 2 sleepless nights to think about what I wanted to say and had thrown out every version of it that sounded rehearsed, I just said the plain thing. "I'm glad, and I missed having you in the house, not the housekeeping, you." She sat very still on the wagon seat, looking down at me. Dale found something urgent to do with the horses that took him well out of earshot, which I noted and appreciated. "Mr. Calder." "Wade," I said. "I think we're well past Mr. Calder." "Wade," she said it careful, like she was trying the shape of it. "I need to say something, and I need you to hear it plain because I've turned it over the whole ride back and I won't feel right till it's said. I don't want you thinking this, whatever this is between us, I don't want you thinking it's the money talking. Not on your side and not on mine. Because if it is, if either of us is telling ourselves a story about being noble or being rescued, it won't hold. I've seen what happens when people build a marriage on a debt instead of a want." "It's not the money," I said. "God knows it's not the money, Joe. I've had money my whole life, and it never once made me feel the way I felt sitting in that chair by your bed waiting for your fever to break. If anything, the money's been in the way of this the whole time, made me suspicious of you before you'd even set your bag down, made me leave folded bills on my own kitchen table like a fool testing a woman who never once needed testing. It's not the money. It's you. It's the way you look at a man and see him instead of his acreage." She climbed down off the wagon then, slow, and stood in front of me in the yard with the late sun coming across the fields behind her, dust still on her boots same as the first day, and she said, "My mother asked me before I left to come back here whether I loved you or whether I was grateful to you, and whether I could tell the difference. I told her I could. I told her gratitude doesn't keep a person up at night wondering how a man's leg is healing 3 days after there's any medical need left to wonder about it." I laughed again, that same rusty laugh I wasn't yet used to the sound of coming out of my own chest, and she laughed too, and it was in the middle of that laughing, easy and unguarded, both of us standing in a dusty yard with a wagon horse stamping nearby and Dale Whitfield very deliberately checking a fence rail 40 yards off, that I reached out and took her hand, not the way I'd taken it the night of the fever, careful and uncertain, but sure. The way you take hold of something you've decided you mean to keep. She let me, more than let me. She stepped in close, put her free hand flat against my chest, right over where my heart was going faster than a man my age with a mended leg had any business letting it go, and she looked up at me with that same steady, unimpressed, entirely honest look she'd given me the very first evening over a badly splinted leg, and she said, "Well, Wade Calder, I suppose you'd better show me that ledger of yours if we're going to be running this ranch together. I want to see the books before I agree to anything permanent. I don't take a man's word for his worth. I've told you that before." "You already know my worth," I said. "You've known it longer than I have." She smiled at that, a real smile, the first one I'd seen unguarded on her whole face, and she didn't say anything else, just tipped her head up, and I bent down, and the whole valley could have been watching for all either of us cared by then. And it didn't matter one bit what Loretta Vance or anybody else in that county had to say about a rich man and a widow's daughter, because for the first time in my whole grown life somebody was choosing me plain, for nothing I owned and everything I was. That's the entry in the margin, the one in the hand that isn't mine. I asked her to write it herself, months later, the night I finally told her the whole business about testing her with the money, about my father's talk of numbers never lying, about 34 years of believing nobody could want the man without wanting the ranch that came attached to him. She took the pen, held it light and quick, the way my father used to, which I've never told her, because I think it would embarrass us both, and under the last entry my father ever made, She wrote 4 words in that careful hand of hers and closed the book, and set it back on the desk where it sat ever since, open most nights to that same page, because I like looking at it. Married for the man, not the money. I don't work that ledger the way I used to. Still keep it. My father would come up out of the ground if I let 100 years of accounts go to rot, but the columns don't carry the weight they once did. Joe does the books with me most evenings now at the same desk, in a second chair I had built to match the crack in mine, and some nights we don't talk about cattle or wages at all. Just sit there with the lamp burning down and her hand resting easy on my arm, and I think about a boy of 19 who believed a number could tell you everything true about a man, and I think, no, son, not everything. Some things you only find out when somebody rides out to your ranch expecting nothing, and stays anyway, and looks at you like you were worth the trip all along.